Hello, Sasha.
Hi, Stella. How are you doing?
I am well. I'm well. I'm kind of in good form. A lot of the extraordinary levels of what are they called? Commitments that I kind
Yeah,
of started a year or two ago have kind of been put in. So I just feel a
yeah.
lot less tension, a lot less to do. There's still plenty.
That's really good. And meanwhile, you're still preparing for Killarney, which
Oh,
goes to show how unbelievably busy and how many big commitments you obviously have. If
it's
Killarney is like, oh, I barely have anything going on now.
well, I think it's actually kind of very relevant to this episode is that this is an extraordinary world that can take your whole life. And
Yeah,
I think it kind of took my whole life for the last year.
yeah,
And now I'm kind of saying, hello, children, how are you?
yeah.
What's your name?
How old are you now? Yeah.
Yeah. So I think I've been in a thing for about a year
Mm.
now, and I'm glad to feel like I'm getting a bit of sun on
Oh,
my skin and a bit of
that's
time
really
to,
great.
yeah.
And I'm excited to spend time together. It's always nice when we get to be together.
Well,
Yeah.
you're going to meet my family. You can come in and tell
I
everybody what you
can't
think of
wait. I'll
them.
ask your kids what their names are and I'll be like, "Hey, the girl's named this and the boy's named that." I'm just kidding. I know your kids' names. Yeah, I think it's going to be great and to be honest, today's episode we had recorded it a little while ago. We sat on it.
Yeah.
And as often happens after we record something, after maybe 24 to 48 hours, I will be able to kind of marinate on the discussion and then I'll have new thoughts about it. And I'm pretty sure that soon after I actually texted you freaking
Yeah.
out like, no, we can't release this episode. I feel terrible about it.
I
And I got
I was
nervous.
stunned. I was stunned because I thought it was brilliant. I thought it was really,
Yeah.
really powerful. I did think it was thought provoking, but I thought this is going to be, sometimes we do an episode and I think, I really think we've helped people. I really
Yeah.
think
Yes.
this is going to be thought provoking, maybe challenging, but ultimately valuable and helpful. And I
Yeah.
love the word helpful. Like, is it helping? And so when you said that, I was like, really? What? And you
Yeah.
were like, whoa. So go
Yeah.
on.
So I think my reason for feeling really nervous is like as you'll hear shortly, today we talk about the different kinds of ways people get into an obsession over gender. The types of people that are caught up in the gender debates. And we kind of break down like what we see as like various kind of characters or like archetypes of people who are deeply deeply involved in the gender debates. And I think the reason I felt so uncomfortable with the episode is that typically we have a topic
Yeah.
and we go in great depth into this topic and we look at it from multiple different perspectives, different angles. We kind of dissect it. We go really deep and it's very thorough. I think our analyses of various topics tend to be pretty thorough. There are always episodes where at the end of it I say, gosh, there was a lot more to say.
Yeah.
But I
Yeah.
usually feel like I have given this a good faith examination from lots of angles. But how I felt after this episode is that we just kind of like shouted out these types of people and said like one or two things about them and moved on. So it's like we got the lawyers involved and this is what we think of the lawyers and there's the ROGD parent and this is the kind of character they have. And really like each of those personality types or types of people, which we're included, we're obviously obsessed with gender. Like I
Utterly.
feel like we could have done justice to them better if each kind of type of person
Oh,
had their
yeah.
full episode. So I
That's such a
felt
good
like
point.
we might have kind of just barely skimmed over. And there are going to be, I can imagine if I were an audience member, because I listened to it the other day to refresh, I was listening to it and thinking, I can think of a million examples of that not being true. Like I thought of all of
Mhm.
these kind of contradictory points. But I think the point of the episode was lots of people get very obsessed with gender. And
Yes.
sometimes it's important if you are obsessed with gender to reflect on what brought you there, whether being deeply involved in the debates in the particular way that we talk about is serving you, serving your kids, serving your community, serving your family. And so we kind of dig into that.
And I would say I have the utmost respect of everybody who's kind of obsessed with gender, because they are my people, frankly. Because I think gender in the 21st century is so compelling because it has everything. It has, free speech. It has silencing of speech. It has your very essence of what it is to be you. What makes you a woman? What makes you a man? What is femininity? What is masculinity? It's drilling down so deep. And is it the patriarchy? Is it transhumanism? Is it a confluence of events? What is psychology? Does it help? What do we need to... It just everything. Yes. Journalism. Yes. Education.
Medical stuff.
Legal definitions. Yeah. Like it has everything. So I think anybody who gets obsessed with gender, I think, chapeau. Yes, so you should. Having said that, too much of a good thing. And like some people are really, I shouldn't say it's too much of a good thing, because some people are in distraught, terrible places. Yeah. They didn't want to get obsessed with gender. They didn't want anything to do with it, and they got put in that place. Other people have ended up there and they can't get away because it's such a compelling subject. There's loads of different ways to become involved. I think what we do in this episode, is what I thought, is that we raise a bit of awareness of the ways a few people could fall in, and you could hold it too tightly. And I say that as somebody who definitely tends towards holding things too tightly. And I benefit when I remember, smell the roses, kick back, enjoy your coffee, have a game of tennis with your mate who doesn't know anything about gender and finds it boring. Do you know what I mean? Because sometimes, honestly, the sun on your skin is so much more pleasant than any kind of reading a new paper. And the kind of the intellectual curiosity that a lot of people have around gender, that kind of feed me more. It's very, very distracting and compelling. Yeah. And we, as people who are interested in mental health, have to be wary of that. We have to be wary of, I feel my whole 20s, I intellectualized everything and never got to the feelings and never got to the good places. You can just think all the time. Mm-hmm. And that's my danger. And I'd say a lot of people who haven't been thrust into it, the people who are in it, like myself and yourself, the writers, the journalists who don't need to be in it, I think they probably very often are very intellectually curious, and it's very compelling in that manner. And you can get too into it, too far east is west, as they say. Yeah.
So I mean, with that aside, when I think about this discussion, I feel like actually, rather than being nervous to publish it, what I'd like to do actually is expand on it, because I think there are a lot of ways people fall into gender that we didn't get to cover. And as I was thinking about this, I was spinning off into all these other ideas. And I think the more we can, because of course you and I definitely fit into a lot of these categories, the more we can recognize ourselves just brings a little self-awareness, which is part of what we talk about all the time, how important that is. So we hope that this is interesting. We heard some feedback from others that this is an interesting episode, so maybe I'm a little paranoid and a little nervous, which I tend to be. You know that about me. But with that, we will leave it to
I tend to be over-optimistic and think everything is great.
We balance each other out. All right, so here is the episode.
Hi, I'm Stella O'Malley, a psychotherapist in Ireland.
And I'm Sasha Ayad, an adolescent therapist in the United States.
Through in-depth interviews, personal stories, and psychological exploration, we probe the gender landscape within contemporary culture.
And we consider the implications of prioritizing personal identity over other aspects of the self.
This is the thinking person's take on gender.
Join us as we look at gender from a wider lens. Today we're talking about something very interesting, which is, I think for me, this really got sparked by our conversation about detransitioners when we talked about moving beyond the political identity. And it got me thinking about all of the different kind of characters and identities and like camps, silos that are embedded within this kind of culture war debate around gender.
Mm-hmm.
And we started talking about it a little bit, and we just went on and on and on. And we think that's a very interesting lens. Because I don't know about you, but I the way I think of myself, I really don't want to be part of any camp. I don't want to be dogmatic about anything. I'm primarily a therapist, and I definitely land in a certain perspective on child medicalization, but I don't necessarily share the same perspectives or views with other people who may also be against childhood medicalization, right? So I would like to just talk about this together today, and I think it's gonna be interesting and a bit tricky.
I think so. We could successfully annoy everybody, which will be enjoyable. I think there's a Venn diagram where gender would be in the middle, and people who are interested in gender, and the outsides of that is there's an awful lot of different identities, and it's so interesting. Whatever direction you're coming at, pretty much all of us think we're right. We have it right. I often call it the Goldilocks syndrome, where everybody thinks they have it just right, and everybody else is just a little bit wrong, a little bit this way, a little bit that way. But I have it just right, and they basically sell their just right position to, and I do it myself, to everybody else. But you see what you just said, which I think is classic of the. And I am you, so I'm not judging you. But classic of the certain. So many of us are lone wolves. We're like, I'm not in any group that I don't want to be in any group. I'm fundamentally, and almost before I'm a therapist, I'm a lone wolf. I do my own thing, what's the word? Paddle my own canoe, all the phrases, you know what I mean? And there's something about that independent thinker, lone wolf, that seems to me to be often gender critical. I've said this 100 times, but I would love to do personality analysis of people who became gender critical, because there's some sort of what's the word? They're almost combatively on their own. No, and every single group you're in. No, I don't think we should do this. No, I don't think we should. Everybody disagrees, and it was very well named. Even though I never liked the phrase gender critical, I've never really. Not where I land, of course. This is classic lone wolf. Here's me embarrassing myself, but the fact is, critics, do you know what I mean? The very, very good critics. They're very, very, very highly developed sense of criticism. And they can criticize anything, any good paper, any good thought, any good anything. And so it can very quickly, in that world, and we have to get into the different identities because I know it's gone straight into one, but it can become just relentless criticism, which is really interesting intellectually, but it is what's happening.
Which I think that's almost like the academic. I mean, we hadn't even put this on our list when we were brainstorming it, but there's an academic who's drawn to this. And frankly, academics, are of course analyzing things from different perspectives based on their field and what they've studied. But you're talking about the person who is trained and very adept at analyzing and critiquing. Here are the kind of philosophical issues with this argument or with this position, and that's interesting to me.
And so let's say we'll produce one identity, and there's going to be a few in this episode. So one identity is the kind of the academic critic, and some of those academic critics, maybe the more intellectual critics, because they mightn't be academic, but they're naturally intellectual, they're naturally cerebral, and they're naturally saying, "Oh no, that's not quite true." And off they go and they study, they know their stuff, they're very, very rabbit hole-y, because in they go and they come out with, a paper from 1976 that they came across after 6 hours of study. It's intellectually very absorbing. I have plenty of this in me, that intellectual critic, but it's one of the one of the identities, and it can feel like an all-consuming world
Yeah.
to be in that.
Yeah.
And I feel that there's an awful lot of kind of self-praise in that world because
Mm,
they're, they've really analyzed it, and they kind of it's very nice to feel that you're at the top of your game and you know exactly what's going down
mm-hmm.
and you know all the research. I'm feeling a bit
Yeah.
uneasy saying all that, but it's true.
Yeah, that's interesting, and I'm thinking too about how there are people maybe who take a more gender skeptical perspective. I mean, gender critical has become a term that kind of ran away, and it's now used by, like, for example, I keep seeing people from the like radical trans activism groups calling me like a gender critical feminist or something,
Me
which I'm
too.
not really. I mean,
Nowhere
I
near.
don't think so
Yeah.
at all. So that term gender critical in and of itself has kind of snowballed into something else. But there are academics definitely on kind of all sides of the argument, and they're like purely coming from this academic framework, and that's kind of interesting. Um, I don't know if that's an identity per se, because I think academics, that's their job to analyze and critique. But I do think there are certain kinds of identities that have emerged out of this that are
Yeah.
really new. Like academics have always existed and they've always gotten into like debates about things. But the ROGD parent, that is a new kind of identity.
And they are often, there is a type, you could say there's a classic ROGD parent. And they're
Mhm.
off, I'll give you what I would say is a classic ROGD. They're often very cerebral, very researchy, very into kind of learning an awful lot. Well informed, I would argue. Certainly, that there's, they generally, if they don't know it, they know the gist of it and would be able to find you these exact facts quite quickly. Not massively in touch with other parts of life. That there's a kind of there's a feeling of real intellectualism kind of
Mm,
overriding their identity, and not maybe all that interested in more emotional, earthy parts of life.
mm,
It's a kind of a kind of intellectual control that I
mm,
see, and it can be over involved would be an issue, and weirdly, a slightly just I can't help but say it because I see it so often. Very often with that gentle, mild mannered fear of conflict as well. There's that
mhm,
whole side of them, and I've always thought, is that the combo? Is that what makes it these
mm.
parents? Or am I just happening to see those two? And is it my bias that sees that's my ROGD parent?
Mm,
What is
mhm.
your OG? Is that what you see, or is it something?
Well, when I was thinking about this, what was on my mind was more of like this kind of political identity that has emerged. And I'm thinking, especially within the context of American politics, which is so polarizing, there's definitely a kind of ROGD parent who becomes a kind of campaigner or an activist against, let's say, gender medicine as an industry, against schools who are like affirming children without parent knowledge. And I'm thinking about that kind of super resourceful, often someone with like experience within law or maybe even politics, or like physicians, engineers, people who are kind of educated and resourceful and able to access like supports, able to quickly kind of like gather other professionals and people on their team to make like some kind of legislative pushes, like parents like that. I'm thinking about the kind of ROGD activist parent, um, which definitely has more of like a kind of a mission attached to that identity. And I agree with everything you said, because that's
Uh-huh.
definitely the profile of parents I've worked with before. But I was kind of thinking about this person who's a little bit in the public eye, like starting to write and talk about their experiences, trying to bring awareness,
Yeah.
to this issue.
And that parent who, to me, there's two parents here. There's the RGD, classic RGD parent, who's a certain type, cerebral, quiet, gentle. Then there's the RGD activist parent who is feistier, and is more zeroing in on the political side of it. Often you could argue channeling a kind of an absolute impotence, a powerlessness in their life into that. I would see that. I know you're nervous around it. I would see that in many cases in the parents I see. I know their circumstances and I can see why they're doing it. And I say to myself, I would do that in those circumstances. It depends on the circumstance. Sometimes it can be a way of just running away from the utter difficulty, the complexity, the messiness of emotional kind of distress at home. It's so much
Mm,
easier. It's such a brilliant distraction to get into this
mm,
because it's so
mm-hmm,
compelling. There's news every single day, every 6 hours. There's a
mm-hmm,
have you
mm-hmm,
seen? It's
mm-hmm,
unbelievable. So you can
mm-hmm.
always be occupied and preoccupied. So I do think some of them, it's a displacement activity. And
Yeah.
sometimes it's a healthy displacement activity, and sometimes it's an unhealthy. And that's really for, I think, the parent to figure out, am I using this as a way to avoid problems that I really should address? You know, that lovely
Mm.
prayer from AA, you know, God, help me accept the things I can, the courage, what is it? The courage to
I
accept
think
the
it's like
things.
grant me the serenity to accept the things I cannot change and maybe the courage to change the things I can or something
And the
kind of like
wisdom to
that.
know the difference.
Oh, the
And
wisdom to know the
that's the
difference. Yeah.
key, the wisdom to know the difference, because sometimes you can change things and you should zero back into your family because they need you, and you're actually using this as a displacement because it's so hard at home, and
Yeah.
it's easier to be out in the political realm, whatever that may be. But for others, there's nothing you can do. Maybe
Yeah.
they've left. Maybe there is maybe they've left. They've gone to college. Maybe they've left,
Mm.
and you're just left with all these thoughts and emotions, and or maybe you're too intense and you need to kind of dilute yourself in a little way.
Yeah.
Debatable.
I I don't know if this falls in the same place, but before we started, we were kind of talking about people who, whether they're a parent or not, they get into the gender debates and then they basically just become a full-time gender person. And they stop doing their activities, they stop participating with other kind of interests they used to have. It becomes gender 24/7.
Yeah.
And that seems like a very, I mean, that's really a unique aspect of this particular time and place where, like, you can get online and be fed story after story after story,
Yeah.
which enrages you, and it keeps you locked into this sense of some sort of like a holy mission almost. That, like, I have to martyr myself for this cause, this gender cause. And I'm wondering, what do you think of that? Because
I,
I see that a lot.
I see that a lot. I have every piece of empathy with it because I fall into that myself. I kind of think it's a very compelling subject. It has everything for you, if you follow me. It's got social, psychological, cultural, political. It's got everything, if you follow me. And it therefore it's very easy to become fully absorbed in it. And then a lot of people fall into this category where they know too much and they feel like they can't quite hang out with other people who don't know anything about it. They feel disaffected and alienated, and they're living in an intensity that maybe they've never lived before.
Yeah.
Certainly, I look back at my life pre-gender, and honestly, it was a nice life. I was releasing my books. I had my clinical practice. It was very pleasant, but it ratcheted up in intensity since I've become absorbed in gender, and I'm a bit shocked at how intense it is. All the kind of more milder pursuits I was following have gone. Not all of the good ones, but watching kind of vegetable telly, for example. There's a few things that I don't do that I used to do a lot of. And so I'm kind of thinking the intensity is very attractive, but it's also we'll all burn out. Do you know what I mean? And I feel now we're quite a few years in, people are feeling quite burnt out.
Mm. Yeah, that's huge. I agree. Like, and something I'm really conscious of as a therapist is being really careful about all the projections. Like, when we were talking about detransitioners and their identities, like you mentioned this really important point, which is that, you know, detransitioners who are trying to move on with their life, they can go get some job that doesn't pay very well, and they're pretty much just like a regular person, or maybe people don't receive their story well, and then they come online and they're like a celebrity, you know, and they're brilliant and everyone loves them, and your work is changing my life. And you know, these kinds of things are actually very important to be careful with. And I'm aware that, like, I know our work has helped a lot of people and it's really powerful, and I am so proud of that. And also I try to be very careful about all these projections, because you can fail to see your own blind spots if you become too bought into any one stance that you've taken. And I do wonder about all of these kind of like internet characters who make a living off of the gender wars. And I think because I'm a lone wolf kind of person, as soon as I start getting lumped in with people, I get very bristly, to be honest. I don't like it. I'm not comfortable there. I don't want to be part of a group. I've always been anti-group. Like, I've never been in a sorority. I've never been part of group sports. I'm an individual kind of interest person. So the second people start saying, oh, Sasha's gender critical this, gender critical that, I go, whoa, 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 whoa. Like, I'm not comfortable here, actually. And frankly, like, there's some things I just don't see in the same way as these groups. So I don't know where I was going with that, but it's like there are a lot of projections and a lot of, I think, like slight or overt pressures to like feed your audience what they want to hear. Right. You know? And there are certain like commentators that this is their full-time gig now is gender. I mean, us included. So it's just, I don't know what to make of it. It's a weird thing.
Well, the celebrity Twitter account is an identity, if you follow me. There's some brilliant, and I shouldn't just say Twitter, but notably Twitter accounts, which are phenomenal. And I can think of a few that you just think, oh, here they go. Here comes a thread. Like, they're off. You know what I mean? They'll get thousands of likes and shares and stuff. And they're really high number of followers. And then I've met them, especially when I go over to London. I meet them and they're living such a quiet life. And I realize that they work in computers, or they work as something really nothing to do with it. But their main life is the Twitter account, if you follow me. Their working life is just to make money. It reminds me of in Ireland we have trad musicians, traditional musicians. And very often they don't even talk about their job. Oh, I'm a teacher, or I'm a librarian. They don't even hear it. Their main work is their music, where they don't frankly get very much money, but they get a huge amount of status and purpose, and they love it, and they know they're brilliant at it, and they kind of, it gives them their sense of life. And it seems similar but not as healthy to be the same in a Twitter account. Like, you're at your best with your Twitter account. You're brilliant at nailing this particular point. You get a huge amount of response from the world. And you're brilliant, if you follow me. Some of these accounts are phenomenal. I don't know where I'm going. It's an interesting personality, identity that has come out of all this. And it's like they're brilliant Twitter accounts. That's what they are. And then when you meet them and you're like, oh my God, this is your life. As in you've got a different job, and all of that amazing talent is effectively just channeled into Twitter. I don't think they're making money from it. I think it's like the trad musicians. They're getting everything else. Do you know what I mean? Some of them have Substacks. I suppose we all have a Substack at this stage. But I'm not sure how much money is being made at it. But there's another type which is kind of linked to another identity that comes to mind, which is kind of linked with this one, which is I often think it's the accidental gender critical, where they had a family, they were working, life was perfectly normal and healthy and low key, and they fell into this and have become, they eat, live, breathe, sleep it. And I'm part of this. Like I say, I'm going to say no judgment all the way through this, because I totally understand how people do fall into this subject. But yeah, they can't quite believe they've become so obsessed.
Yeah.
And they say very regularly, I'm obsessed with this. My partner tells me I'm obsessed with it. This is extraordinary. I've never felt so engaged or uptight or upset or intense about a subject in my life. I've never felt so politically engaged. So I'm not sure what's going on that. Is that somebody who's ripe to get engaged? And this is the subject they found. Or, which I actually believe is what's happening, is this an incredibly engaging subject? You're not so sure, but this is what I think.
Well, I'm trying to figure out where I stand here. I mean, I don't want to like keep talking about my own experience, but I mean, it's just so thought provoking. I mean, when you were talking about the trad musicians,
Yeah.
that was me with dance, I think. And there was at least a 5-year period of my life where like I really worked so that I could think about and research and study dance. Like that was, and then gender kind of almost pulled me out of it. And dance has really gone into the very, very background of my life.
That's so interesting.
But you're right. Like there are some people who it's almost like they never were fully alive and awake until this gender thing came up. And then all of their like life force / libido is like poured into this, which I don't know. I don't know what to say about that. And I mean, that's what's so challenging. It's a beautiful thing to like really find something that you are engaged with and passionate about and want to learn about. And also what happens when that directly contradicts your ability to feel normal, feel human. I mean, I want to talk a little bit about I don't know if it's the word is depression, but the kind of despair that sometimes happens, like when people are following the medical scandal aspect of this specifically, or if let's say you take, because there are so many different pieces of the gender debates that are troubling, right? So let's say you want to focus just on incidences of trans-identified male people in prisons, right?
Yeah.
If that's what you look at 24 hours a day, it's so dismal and distressing. And it can lead people into a very, very dark mental space. Mm-hmm. And it's not that those instances don't deserve like a great deal of focus and attention, because they do. But I'm reminded of times when like I was really, really into radical feminist analysis, and particularly the way that pops up on social media. I was just getting like feed after feed of like horrific stories of abuse of women. Horrific. And it just warped my perspective so much that I was like seeing that trauma everywhere around me all the time when really it wasn't there, you know? So I do wonder, and I'm no longer in that space mentally, thank God, but like I do wonder, people who get really obsessed with like one or two aspects of the kind of gender wars, do they fall into this really dark hole where they're actually kind of warped? And maybe they are seeing like nefarious purposes when maybe it's more complicated than that. Or maybe it's not as like evil as they think it is. You know, I'm trying to be careful here, but do you see where I'm going?
I see where you're going, and I'm going to push back a little bit, but I do see where you're going. I do think there are people, I do agree. There is definitely people, and they have, and I think they'll be listening thinking, I've lost myself, and I'm thinking I'm going to get attacked. I've lost my sense of happiness. I've lost myself in this, and I'm in deep distress. I am actually in deep distress. So there are those people who will have gone into that really dark place, and I would like to remind them, you're not handcuffed to a radiator here. You can free yourself. You can go and hang out with an old friend, and it might be a bit boring, and it won't be as intense, and they won't understand lots of things, but you can rehabilitate towards, like I say, kind of boring normal life. And it's almost like the way gangsters sometimes talk about how they don't want to go back to ordinary life. Do you know what I mean? Because it was so compelling living the life. If you live in a very intense way, to go back to ordinary, let's go for a coffee and shoot the breeze about kind of non-events, it's not attractive. It's a little bit deadening. And I think that's happening a little bit. However, to push back, the reason why I'm talking to you and why you're talking to me is because something horrific has happened. And the silencing of debate around the horrors that have happened has kept me talking about it. And every time you kind of peel this onion, you find deeper and deeper awful events that it's genuinely one of the most shocking, actually the most shocking phenomenon of my life. I haven't come across something that's equivalent. You know what I mean? The kind of the silencing, the capturing of institutions, the capturing of policies, the kind of the capturing of ordinary people, the extraordinary down is up and up is down. So many things are happening that you could argue, yeah, there's a really valid reason for people to become utterly absorbed. Once you see it, it's very hard to unsee it. There's a certain type of person who can step back, but an awful lot of people, once they go in, random people, like funny people telling me, I can't believe I have nothing to do with this. I have nothing to do with this. And I'm just eating, breathing it, And I kind of saw it happen with my husband, funnily enough, because when he first into it, he used to go, yeah, that's enough of gender now, Stella, like, stop, I've enough. And now all these, he comes up with his own stories, he adds, he's just as into it. So there is something extraordinary happening, I would argue.
I think you're right. I'm going to say something, I don't know, may not make me popular, but I do wonder, like, so for example, I'll just share, when I was working with middle schoolers and high schoolers at the charter school, I was encountering in my daily work, like, horrific trauma and generational problems and child abuse. And I also felt at that time just as overwhelmed by, like, why does nobody care about this? How do so many people not know, like, the kind of lives that these kids are living through, and, like, the way poverty and destitution can tear up families? Like, so I was very fortunate to have been raised in, a family with kind of normal problems, but, like, loving. I never went hungry. Like, I never really had problems. And then when I was working with these populations, and I also worked with child abuse survivors, sexual abuse survivors, women who were in domestic violence. And when you work with those kinds of populations, there's a similar feeling, which is, this is so unbelievably unfair. People have the cards stacked up against them so badly, and nobody's listening. Like, so many women were going to the police with horrific stories, and nobody was being listened to. A lot of perpetrators were never, so, obviously a lot of the same women who have those concerns are now concerned about gender because of the way, like you said, it's this up is down, like, it's obfuscating all of these problems that feminists have been trying to work for a long time. And, like, lots of advocacy work. So, but I do sometimes wonder if, like, the person who is, let's say, a computer engineer who's never really been part of, social services or mental health care, like, maybe for the first time for that person, they're realizing, oh my God, horrific things can happen, and our government's not going to do anything about it, and doctors don't really understand what's going on. And I do think gender is to a different scale. I do think it's, and I've said it many times, it's like the most shocking thing I've ever witnessed. But I don't think this is the only example, of, like, a horrific thing flying under the radar.
I have used your analogy and I've made your argument, and I've pulled back a little bit from it because I've said it about, let's say, homelessness. I know a lot about homelessness and the awful, awful traps of homelessness and addiction, and but however, it's the capture. I know what you're talking about, abused people getting dismissed. It's the capture. It's people believing something and they don't quite know what they believe. It's the silencing of debate. It's the strange lies, the strange kind of huge amount of ordinary people presuming something that is wrong. There is something shocking happening. But we should go back to our identities, you know what I mean? Because
Okay.
we could argue this all night. But yeah, there's a few other identities that I think. The classic one would be that we've all met. It would be the rad femme, the radical feminist, who has often been there for 30 years saying, you've all finally arrived.
Yeah.
We saw this coming forever. There's only one analysis of this, and it's the feminist, the radical feminist outlook. And now you're all listening to us. And then it's like, hey, you fools, stop looking at other directions. Stop looking at psychological. Stop looking at anything else. There's only one way. This is the radical feminist. So sometimes they can feel like their day has come, And then it can feel very, very, I've noticed an awful lot of them can feel very, very saddened and distressed because it's not, people aren't slapping their forehead and saying, yes, this is the one truth. I think.
Yeah. No, I think so. I mean, there's definitely like a belief system within the RADFEM analysis which kind of accounts for everything. And it's like, to me, there are certain parts of the ROGD phenomenon or the medicalization phenomenon that don't necessarily fit into that narrative, but there's an attempt to make everything fit into that narrative.
Yeah. We hope you're enjoying this episode of our podcast. We work very hard to maintain high quality content for the show.
To take an even deeper dive and support the show, join our listener community for access to exclusive content, practical tools, and resources supporting gender and identity exploration. We're so grateful to our sponsor, GenSpect, an international organization which offers an alternative to WPATH, providing a range of education, resources, and supports to anyone impacted by gender distress. GenSpect unites many different organizations globally and gives voice to thousands of previously untold stories. For more info, visit genspect.org.
And thank you to our sponsor, RIME. Rethink Identity Medicine Ethics is a non-profit organisation dedicated to improving long-term care for gender-variant individuals. Visit rethinkime.org to learn more.
And now back to the conversation.
What other identities is there?
What about the affirming parent?
Oh yeah.
The parent who's not just affirming, but has made this their mission to, quote, protect trans kids. I think that's how it's most often phrased.
The trans parent who's made it their life's goal to show their love to their child. And, you know, they get an awful lot of, I think, really horrible criticism. And I think if they believe in gender identity theory, whether they know they believe in it or not, if they've assimilated gender identity theory, then I think they're doing right by their child as they know it. You know what I mean? I don't think this is necessarily the narcissism that a lot of people think it is. They think they have a huge world to fight where bigotry and transphobia is everywhere. And they think that this is the fight of my life. I am part of the new world order. There's thousands and hundreds of thousands of people who don't understand this. And I have to be part of the pioneering world who teaches this.
Yeah, and I don't know at this point if our interview with Rose will be out, but that was an amazing interview that everybody should listen to. And I think that is one type of affirming parent, right? An affirming parent who is really genuinely doing what they believe is best based on this theory of gender identity. I do think there's probably another kind of parent that by definition is not coming across our radar, who is using their child's story as a kind of political move. And I mean, the same hesitation I have about using children in politics for anything, even if it's an issue I agree with. Like, I think that is very risky, and I don't think putting your child in the political spotlight is a good idea for any issue. I think it's very dangerous.
And it was the reason I got into this was I read about Cyril Doty and Corey Doty, and you know the trans parent had a child who was a baby, you know, called them baby, and then applied to the Canadian courts for the right to have the child under U, as in unassigned or unknown, rather than female or male. And it was that imposition of politics, I felt, politics on the child. I do think when I saw that a lot in Ireland. There's an awful lot of, you know, children who are brought up to be Republican, and not Republican in the American sense, in the kind of Irish sense, very Irish nationalist. You know, you bring them up, you know, singing ballad songs at a young age and stuff. So there's a certain type of imposition of politics on children in Ireland. And I also saw in real life people getting radicalized. So that I think there's a whole type of person who is the radicalized identity, where it's been imposed upon them. They were honestly ordinary, decent people who hadn't got extreme views. and the silencing of debate and being told that they were a bigot and being told that they were transphobic and being told all sorts of things that were wrong about them have maddened them and have radicalized them. And I saw that in Ireland, so much in Northern Irish politics, that they become radicalized. They lose their sense of self and they go very, very radical. I'm sure you've read about it in other cultures. People get radicalized and
Oh,
people
yeah.
get hardened
Yeah.
because of
Yeah.
how people respond to them. And that has happened. There's a whole identity where it's like they've become very hardened and they're really distressed and they've been badly treated by the world, but they're reacting to this bad treatment in a way they're losing themselves. They're losing their own kind of decency or gentleness or something. And I can see why. I get it. I totally get it. But it's something to watch out for.
Yeah, it makes me wonder too, like sometimes it's a kind of like a chicken egg question that comes
Yeah.
up in my mind. Is this radicalism that we see, like this person has kind of glommed onto gender as an excuse to express this like very vitriolic attitude that was dormant underneath? Or does participation in this as like a movement tend towards radicalizing people in general? It's an interesting question because I think I've done lots of study of influence and indoctrination, and I think there are certain types of people who are known to be more susceptible and vulnerable to being radicalized and indoctrinated. But I also wonder, is there something about the way social media algorithms work, the way this is being debated in the public in such a polarizing way that just is going to turn very unassuming people into more hardened, radicalized people? Like, it's an interesting question.
Whoa. Yeah, I think you're right. I think they're both. I think there's people who have the extremist who glommed onto it, and the person who has become it, and they're both hanging out together, uncomfortably.
Yeah.
If you follow
Yeah.
me, and not really. I think there's another identity that it would be the kind of professional activist who's gone from, I don't know, climate change or I don't know, veganism or whatever, and they're all worthy causes. I'm not being dismissive, and this is a new cause, and causes is what is their lifeblood. They're political animals, and this is the cause of the moment. I'm worried about how many people in this whole, both sides are so unhappy. You know what I mean? There does feel like there's an awful lot of wretched distress that I see, which worries me because I do think, it's mostly the privileged Western world. It's a very cerebral, intellectual debate. An awful lot of the attacks are online. If we were to do, there's women in prisons, there's some dreadful stories. But a massive, if we were to do an actual chart of where are the attacks,
Yeah.
they're massively wordy, clever. It feels like it's you can lose yourself in this. You can be really, really lost and sad. I think there's an awful lot of people who are feeling very lost and sad. I think in
Yeah.
both sides of it, really distressed, genuinely devastated, and that makes me look back and try and look at the bigger picture and think, what's that all about? Here we are with our clever arguments and dredging up what they said 3 years ago because what is this? I don't know. It feels like there's something societally going on here, and is it socially media generated? Will we look back and think this is a social media phenomenon that happened or something?
Yeah.
I'm not sure about that.
I find it really weird. Like, I'm trying to figure out how to say this. There's been a lot of talk about like the current generation getting really riled up about political issues. And I've heard some commentators make a point, which I think is valid, which is like there is a kind of glorification of certain types of political struggles that happened in the past, So,
Oh, yeah.
for example, if you're a young person in America and you're learning about the civil rights movement, for example, and you think about these horrific things that were happening to Black Americans, And there can be this kind of very powerful feeling drummed up that like, if there's even a minor infraction today, we want to have the same fervor and the same energy that drew our civil rights leaders from the past, like into their fight, right? And I totally understand the need to have some cause, something that builds meaning. Barry Weiss had an interesting conversation recently with a gentleman who's a journalist but writes a lot about war. And he was talking about like the way veterans sometimes miss the war because they feel like this was the most purposeful thing. And I remember I had a coworker when I worked in the bars, and he was a bartender and he was a veteran. And I remember him saying, I would love to go back into combat. And that totally blew my mind. I didn't understand. And I said, why? And he said, there's no feeling like having your brothers, your metaphorical brothers next to you, and it's life or death, and they will have your back. Coming back to civilian life is like dead compared to that. And like, I will never forget that, right? So I do think there's this sense of mission and conviction that people feel like they have to have. But when it comes to what you were talking about, like, I don't understand or know, were civil rights struggles, or were like the suffragettes, like, were those battles won because there were certain people that refused to have a life outside of their cause? Or were they like also normal people that like, Monday through Friday worked on the activism stuff and then like also went to the zoo with their kids? Like, because it's hard to tell, like, in order to be part of a movement, how dedicated do you have to be? Do you have to really do this at the exclusion of all other things? I mean, I definitely know people in this gender world who, as far as I can tell, their life is pretty much over. Like, all they do is gender 24/7. And it feels like this noble cause. And it is a noble cause, because I do think what's happening to kids is just horrific. And I wonder, in like the big arc of history, where like, if you look at other cultures and other times and other places, horrific things happen to humans all the time. I mean, it's so horrific, the kinds of things that governments do to people and that people do to other people. But I wonder, like, do we overcome these things little by little, or do we all have to throw ourselves into the fire? I don't know.
Well, I don't know either. I do know that in history, yes, definitely some of the great heroes were great heroes for the cause and dreadful for their family, and dreadful family people, and, left unhappy families, very, very unhappy children behind, and they did not attend to their families. There's no doubt about it. And they were heroes. They were absolute heroes, and good for humanity. So that's a personality that has consistently been in history. So that's something to think about. But also there's been the weekend warriors who
the keyboard warriors now that we have.
Yeah. But who do it at the weekend, or do it when it suits them, which is probably more healthy for their life. If you follow me, it's probably a healthier way. You remember Oskar Schindler from Schindler's List, and after the war, he never had any happiness afterwards. So, and he became alcoholic, as far as I remember. And, you know what I mean? And it was the intensity of war is really commonly checked as a kind of something. But one thing I do think that is maybe missing, I might be wrong, but I think an awful lot of people feel a lack of solidarity. That veteran, and I got goosebumps when you're talking about it. He talked about the Brothers in Arms. There is nothing more, because I have had it in other contexts. When people have your back, there's something so nourishing for my soul, or my very being, when somebody has my back. It's something very important for me. I don't feel this movement has been very solidarity. I think it's because everybody's a lone wolf, so they go, well, I can't really agree with you. So off they go. And I think it is because of that, but I do think there's a lack of solidarity, and that might be why so many people feel distressed. I know other movements in other contexts, they've said it was the greatest time of my life. It was huge solidarity. We were all together, and we grew in our communities. Even though it was terrible, it was also the most beautiful time of my life, because we were growing together, fighting something. I'm not sure that's happening at the moment. I'm not sure. I think there's an individualistic vibe that each man for himself. I'm saddened about that, but I strongly believe that is what it is. I think that is happening, which is unfortunate. Is there any other identities within this? There's so many of them. We're probably missing loads.
Oh, there's tons. I mean, I don't think there's a way to cover all of them. I do think there's here, at least in the US, there's a kind of conservative leaning person.
Oh God, yeah.
Who ends up in some ways aligning with people with really different beliefs on other things, right? So like, of course, everyone knows about the Rad Femme and kind of conservative alliances that have been built, which is really interesting. But I think sometimes, from where, at least where I stand, the conservative critics can definitely tip into demeaning and cruel and really dismissive and mocking certain types of, let's say progressive activists, like especially on social media, that becomes a really big thing. And we've talked about this before, like people who kind of make a career off of basically making fun of teenage girls who have a trans identity, who make TikTok videos or something, So that there's a kind of like, let's poke fun and laugh at people who have crazy liberal ideas, like there's that kind of person. And
oh, yikes.
That's really tricky because there's like I always say there's a grain of truth in all of these things, but you can end up hardening yourself to compassion if you go down that road.
As you know, I wrote that book on bully and bully-proof kids, and I kind of got into the different types of bullies there are. And there's one bully which I was glad to highlight, and I don't think people know about very much, is they're very funny. They're very witty. They make the whole class laugh. They're actually brilliant at making us laugh. You can't help but laugh. You bite it, but you can't help but laugh because it's very, very funny. They get their power from it, and you're laughing, but you're becoming part of something that really, it's very laughable. But sometimes one shouldn't laugh, and I love laughing, and I am so fast to slag somebody. It's not right. It really isn't. I've a very quick kind of, I like laughing a lot, too much. But that is something that we need to be very, very, very conscious of. There's an awful lot of just absolutely ripping kind of people up. And it's bullying. It's bullying. There's no doubt about it. But there's another type that are emerging in Ireland, which is kind of horrifying for me, but I shouldn't say horrifying, but shocking, because I thought they'd kind of gone, which is religious zealots. There's an extreme religious zealotry, which I actually thought had gone in Ireland. Now, Ireland's well known for being a very Catholic country, and that has always had quite a strong zealous kind of component in the religion. But there's this new type in Ireland. There's a guy called Enoch Burke, and he was a teacher, and by all accounts a brilliant teacher. And he refused to call a child they them when he was asked. And had it just stayed at that, it could have been an interesting argument. Should a teacher buy into gender identity? He had a very simple: it's plural. I won't. So you know what I mean? He had a very simple standard. But anyway, his religious zealotry ended up in jail. It's been an and then when he was in jail, the prisoners asked him to be removed because he was talking about the Bible all the time. This guy's really a serious zealot. And there's a whole group of outliers, quite a pretty intense group that I had no idea existed, that have emerged. So that's a whole identity that I just didn't know was there. I didn't know it was,
that's fascinating.
Yeah. You knew the Republican religious conservative type was there. I didn't know they were there.
Well, I mean, I'm not talking about zealots, but like one kind of group of people that I've learned about really for the first time. Because like I grew up, my family wasn't particularly religious, but we did have a period of time where we were going to church. And I was kind of one of those people that was like, church. And I'd roll my eyes. Like I was never like really... And then I went through periods of time where I was. But what's interesting to me now is like there's a whole type of Catholic analysis of gender, which is actually really intelligent and profound. And I just have to say, like, the Catholics have put out some incredible, pieces of writing and work around this, which I didn't know. I mean, I didn't realize there was, that's so stupid to say, but I didn't realize there was such a profound and interesting kind of like theological analysis of the body until like this gender stuff has come up. So there are definitely religious zealots who I would say probably don't help this debate at all. But there's also like a lot of very thoughtful and intelligent, like theologically based analyses that I found interesting.
And I've always been very respectful of, there's a certain type of theologian in Ireland, often called in a kind of generalization, the Jesuits, because they're the kind of thinking man's Catholic, and they're very educated, and my God, they're clever. And they will have you know, they'll really make you think. So I welcome that. I welcome thoughtful, even religious, even though I'm not religious, I welcome that into any sort of debate. But they're an identity. There is many different types. And obviously there's a big identity of the trans activist, who I met a lot when I did my film in 2018, and I met an awful lot of trans activists, and I afterwards realized, you know, that this is a certain type of personality. And I read up about activisms and the kind of the hyperfixation, the kind of the very black and white thinking, very one track mind. It's not always, but activists often have these autistic traits that I wasn't aware of. I wasn't aware that there was a link between activism and autism and stuff like that. So that was very, very interesting and makes sense. And it also means you don't get anywhere without these people in life. They are needed, if you follow me. They are needed.
Yeah, it's been fascinating. I mean, I would encourage listeners or viewers to maybe write in the comments, like, what are some other, I guess, archetypes of people within the gender debates? And maybe we can kind of flush some of these ideas out some more.
I guess I've gone into darkness. It's suddenly... Can you see me?
I know. I could see like darkness has descended on Ireland for sure. And it's funny because sometimes in the year it's bright all the time.
Yeah. It's something about the shadow of the light or something. Cause it's gone really dark now. Sorry, I'll have to light on.
No, that's okay. Well, this has been interesting. I mean, do we have any kind of last thoughts about, like, let's say you're in one of these groups, you know, that we've identified, like what's the idea here?
I would like to just call out to anybody who is in one of them, just to remind yourself of, you can get too absorbed into something and you can lose yourself, you can lose your family, you can think those were the gender years and I forgot to just have the simple pleasures of a lovely cup of coffee, or of just, you know, hanging out with the kids, or hanging out with an old friend who doesn't understand gender, or, you know, going to choir, you know, going, you know, I do think we can lose ourselves. And I think it's a long marathon. This is, I think it's going to go on for many years. And I think it's important that we don't, you know, become hardened or lose ourselves, you know?
Yeah, well, that's a great message. All right, Stella. Well, till next time.
I'll go into the darkness now.
Okay. Okay. Bye.
Bye.
Thanks for joining us this week on Gender, A Wider Lens. Listener support means a lot to us. If you enjoy the show, please like and subscribe on iTunes and leave a review.
For more information, visit widerlenspod.com. There you'll learn about joining our listener community, how to contribute to our show, and where to find us on social media.
Our discussions are for educational purposes and are not intended as a substitute for mental health services.